Hi, Katja.
Hi.
So I want to introduce ourselves. I'm Basia Mosinski, and I'm joined here by Katja Faber. And I want to let people know that are just watching this video that both of us are really on social media. And if you want to know more about us, there will be links attached to this video. And by all means, do all the research that you want to find out who we are and what we've done, etc. Didn't want to spend much time doing that here. But what we've decided to do is a series of chats about grief. And neither one of us would be here talking about grief were it not for our children who have passed. So our sons, your son Alex, my son Richard, and my stepson Eric Logan. So after our last conversation, there was a piqued interest about the idea of grief avoidant society. And that kind of came up with something that you said in that last conversation. So do you want to pick up on that and why it is that we're doing this conversation?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. This is one of my pet subjects, if I can put it that way. The way that our Western society, I can't speak for other societies in the rest of the world. The one I know is Western society. How terrified it is of grief, and how when you find yourself grieving the loss of somebody you love or your child, people don't know how to deal with you. And it's not only on a personal level that people don't know how to deal with the loss of somebody you love, but it's society itself. It seems to be terrified of dealing with the subject of loss. We seem to live in a society which is obsessed by happiness and the attainment of happiness and success. And anything that takes away from that must be avoided. And the trouble with that is that it's not a realistic way of living life. Everybody's going to come across grief at some point. But it puts a huge pressure on the grieving to lie about how they feel and to basically hide their emotions and to feel abnormal about how the process is affecting them and transforming them. And so you very often hear people talk, and I have written about this myself, having to wear a mask, having to somehow be a different person to who you really are. And I thought we picked up on this question. Somebody had asked us, and please, anybody who's listening to this, do put questions in the comments, because if we continue doing these conversations, we're very happy to look at these subjects as they come up. And this question was, can you just talk about this very important aspect of grief, which is our grief avoidance society? Having been brought up in Europe, and this is where I live, I do have a view on that there are differences between the US and Europe generally. Not very big differences, but there seems to be slightly more cynical, more sort of damaged way of looking at life in Europe. I don't know whether it's a historical thing. We had armies marching up and down. All of us have histories in our families of the Second World War, and there were dictatorships also not that many years ago in Europe. So this attainment of happiness, it's not something we feel that it's our right to be happy. Clearly, everybody wants to be happy, but somehow, we're sort of like, if we're slightly miserable, which is something I don't get the feeling is normal in the US. I mean, Basia, how do you see that? How do you experience this question of the happiness quotient in the US?
Well, I think this is a very interesting topic because I was raised by a European family. I was born here. So I was the only child that was born here. So I was acculturated to the Declaration of Independence, to my inalienable right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. So it is something that is ingrained that is something that is free to me because I'm a free person. But the contrast of how I grew up with a family that had experienced the war. And what I didn't know until a lot later when I pursued becoming a therapist was that I was witness to trauma. I was witness to grief, loss, and trauma and symptoms of PTSD in my parents and in my sister. So that was something that I saw, I observed, but I didn't quite, it wasn't my experience. So I had wings, so to speak. I could fly a little bit higher. But that grounding in Europe really affected my experience. And then later on, when my stepson died, I understood that grief and loss and shock personally. And the way that I characterize that is my family, when they looked back, there was nothing to go back to. And that was very similar when my stepson died. It was his death, but it was also subsequent losses that happened around that death. Loss of a marriage, loss of where I lived, all these things that happened simultaneously, or at least within a year or so. So that shock and that there's nothing to return to. But then, so here it was, he was my stepson that died. And what I experienced in the people around me was wanting to know the details of how he died. Tell me about the accident, because he died in a head-on train collision. So people wanted to know the details. And what I found was the details really avoided the emotions of what was happening. The details kept us in facts of maybe even lawsuits and discussions like that, as opposed to the loss of this child, the loss of this child. So later on, also 20 years later, my son, my only child, died suddenly. Again, shocked. You'd think that I would have been prepared in some way that this can happen, but I secretly thought that I could escape this from happening again because I had paid my dues. And, maybe that's an American thing, that, this can't happen to someone twice, just the odds of that happening. And yet it did. And it does. The more I'm in this arena, I see it that it is something that happens. But regarding my son's death, there is another experience that I had, and that was that he died in an ICU. And in my opinion, that is the last place that you want to experience a death. It's so, all the energy in that place is about preserving life at all costs, preserving life. And when someone dies, there's just not a shift of energy to this transition and helping a family be with their loved one through this transition. So in hindsight, I see where there could be a lot of improvement in that arena. But that's one of those things that we do, is we take death away and put it somewhere, and it's in a place that it doesn't belong, in an ICU ward with lots of busyness and lots of hurriedness.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this, sorry to interject there, but I mean, I think this question of the historical way that death has been pushed away from our everydays has a big part to play in the way that we don't know how to grieve anymore. I mean, certainly, people go to hospital thinking that they will be saved. If they die there, it is removed physically from their home. And it wasn't that many decades ago that it was quite normal to die at home. Now that is actually quite unusual. And the same goes for giving birth. The minute women were taken to the hospitals to give birth, again, stillbirths and infant mortality now happens in a hospital. And so this means that people are brought up in an environment where they simply don't see somebody dying. They're not present at the death, and certainly they don't see the body in its natural death state at home. And I think that that actually doesn't help very much with dealing with the question of grief, because it is something that is happening far away. And so people just don't have any kind of understanding of what is involved and what is helpful. I particularly would like to pick up on this question that you said, that people asked questions about the facts of the death and not the emotions. That certainly was my experience up to a point. I mean, my son was actually a victim of homicide. And so there was this rather bizarre sort of parallel conversations that I would have. People would ask me, is it okay to ask? And I would have to take myself out of my emotions when I could, because they were asking about the factual side. They didn't ask me about the emotional side. And so it got to the point where I could talk about the trial, the legal aspects, even elements of how he was killed, without opening myself up to the emotional side. Now, that took a while to be able to do. I don't know whether it's healthy and unhealthy. I think, that one I'll leave for somebody who's got years of training. I think it's something that we develop the ability to do. So I don't know, Basia, whether you were able to develop that aspect of just kind of not going into the emotional side, just to be able to deal with the questions coming from others. Because there was an element, I understood why they wanted to know, but I also at the same time found it interesting that they focused on that instead of asking me how I was dealing emotionally. And that's the grief avoidant part of our society,
Yeah. And I think it's very difficult for someone who is around someone who is grieving to know what to say and know how to say it. It's at some points during both of those experiences for me, people just couldn't win, because they wouldn't know where I was at in that particular day, in that particular experience. But things that would stop me in my tracks were when someone would say to me, after just coming up on me, having known about my stepson's death, saying, how are his parents doing? How are his parents doing? And instead of how are you? How are you handling this? How are you managing? How are you feeling? Those kinds of things. But it is very tricky, because there are times also for someone in grief to that where words just don't
No, I mean, and
communicate.
it is such a huge thing that we're faced with. People would come up to me and I could see the terror in their eyes. They didn't know what to say, certainly in the initial months. And I felt almost that it was up to me to say to them, listen, there's nothing you can say that's going to be wrong, because I totally understand that you don't know what to say. So I would give them a platform on which they could at least say, I don't know what to say, or that, because they were terrified. They didn't want to make my hurt worse. I mean, there are so many aspects of this. I mean, one could write volumes, and I think this whole question of the grief avoidance society is huge. And you just touched upon this disenfranchised grief. Do you have the right to feel like you do? How the parents are. The same for siblings.
Yes.
People ask about them. What about the grandparents? What about the friends? It's a huge question. I mean, I'd love to explore this further. I don't know whether people listening to us are saying, well, actually, that's great, but actually what I want to know is X, Y, and Z. So I'm very, very happy to answer people's questions. Basia, you were talking earlier that you felt that we should keep these conversations easy and accessible in length. And I think that is one of the key things, that being able to focus on anything really when you're in grief is so hard.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
this, and you know, to those watching this, we have actually talked about this, Basia and I, that we don't want to have long conversations, even though we could absolutely talk about this for hours,
We could.
because
Yeah.
we
Yeah, we have a
understand that
few other
people,
topics that are so closely linked to this in the ways that people cope with grief
Mhm,
when, you know, when someone is or feels marginalized or feels like there's no place to express what it is that they're feeling, they turn inward. And yet we know it is an inward journey, but not everyone is comfortable with that inward process or knowledgeable about it.
mhm.
Or have, you know, some people don't have a propensity for that. They're more extroverted. So that internal space can be so painful. So people, what do? You know, they overdrink, they overeat, they, you know, all these other things that
Absolutely,
happen, you know. So
absolutely.
that should be a topic that we do
That I would
next
love
as
to talk
well.
about, the externalization, uh, positive and negative ways that that can happen. Just to round it off, this question of our grief avoidance society, the one very, very important change, I think, has been the internet. And
Mhm.
I think it's given all the bereaved the possibility of connecting across continents, to find people that are going through a similar process as them. And I think this really has changed the face of what it means to grieve in our society, that we do have a grief avoidance society on the whole, but because those that are grieving are actively participating in forums, whether it's Facebook groups, whatever it is, watching this video, it gives people the chance to actually write small comments, follow other people, learn about the process of grief, and relate to the story of others. And that makes it less lonely, even though it's a very
Yes.
solitary experience. The fact is that these uh, uh, support groups do exist, whereas before they just didn't. And it really was a solitary and very isolating experience. So from that point of view, I think this is a good thing. This is a positive direction that the whole, you know, loss awareness movement, if I can call it that, is going in. I don't know whether I'm explaining it properly, but I think
Oh,
most people that
exactly.
are actually in this world of the bereaved, I know very few that haven't somehow made some connection online with other people,
It's the
and
first thing
everybody
we
says it
do.
is.
We search who, where, what am I going to do? How am I going to survive this? And we search. We search on
Absolutely.
Google and YouTube and all of those things. So hopefully
I
someone will
mean,
find us and
it would be nice to think that we didn't have to search because our community
mm,
was the place we could go to, but that's just not how it is at the moment. And how long that will take to change, if ever, who knows? Who
yeah.
knows?
Well, let's wrap this one up, and we will return again with another topic. And I look forward to talking with you.
Delighted to be a part of this ongoing conversation, Basia. Thank you for
Thank you so
having me.
much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.